Okay. Welcome everybody to this session. Today we are going to have 3 presentations, and Ian Lawler is going to be the discussant of the session. So just a reminder, we need to stick to the program, so I will let know the presenters when you have 5 minutes left, so you can manage your time. So, well, the first presenters are Mauricio Dieter and Jessica Damata from the University of Sao Paulo, Brazil. So, start with your presentation. I don't know if you want to share your screen.
Yes, just a second.
Okay.
Do you all see it?
Yes.
So, hi everyone. I am Jessica Damata. I am a lawyer and a researcher in Brazil, and I'm very honored to be here with such great scholars. The event has been fantastic. Congratulations to Luis, Massimo, and everybody else involved in the organizing of the event, and thank you for the opportunity to listen to you and to present some of my ideas. So my talk is about social control strategies in Brazil, how stop and search and the imprisonment of non-convicts shaped Brazilian mass incarceration. A lot of the ideas presented here come from my master's research, which was supervised by Professor Mauricio Dieter. And my talk has 2 parts. The first part is a preliminary part where I talk about some theoretical concerns and limits to our discussion very briefly, and talk about distinctive features of Brazilian mass incarceration. So just we are in the same page when we talk about that. And then the case of São Paulo, I believe that Jean Daudelin has already talked about that yesterday, and some other people as well. And I also believe we cannot treat Brazil as a unit, and we will be talking about that a little bit. And after that, I can get into the content of my research, which is a case study properly of São Paulo. And I'll be talking about the political transition from a military dictatorship to a free election republic, and highlighting what I believe is one of the most important process to crime and punishment from that period, which is the bureaucratization of police practices, that instead of undermining or overcoming a long-standing tradition of police arbitrariness, it combined with it in a very peculiar manner, and then generated 2 new forms of state-sponsored social control that are stop and search as a policy. Of course, stop and search is always a elementary feature of police power, but in the late 1990s in São Paulo, and what we had was for the first time in its history, policing conducted a stop and search in a rationalized, productivity-driven manner, and it had custodial arrests as its primary goal. So I believe those are the driving forces of mass incarceration in São Paulo, which help explain mass incarceration in Brazil. And after that, we can theorize a little bit on the political meaning of a change and inertia considering that process. So theoretical concerns, I'll be very brief. I believe the discussions on the yesterday's panels have already covered this. I mean, we cannot discard upfront cultural or economical explanations at risk of unilateral theorizing, so we cannot do that. And apart from that, we have already discussed also how the Brazilian criminal justice system has always focused on the selective incapacitation of marginalized populations instead of discipline. And I think there are a lot of explanations for it, but it is very relevant to emphasize that relevant theory connects with a political change, in my opinion. We want to do theory in order to change what we see in the world. We have to understand it so we can transform it. And I believe that for that end, it is key to think about causal links. And we can only think about causal links if we consider properly the continuities and discontinuities in historical development. And we have discussed that yesterday, but in order for my talk to be clearer, I think it is important also to explain some categories I'll be using. So social control, I use the Stan Cohen's definition in Visuals of Social Control, that is planned responses to deviance. So I'm thinking about deviance and not every institutionalized form of conformity forming. When I talk about imprisonment, I'll be talking about all type of liberty restriction in confined spaces by the state, in that case by the state. And I'll be talking about a free election republic instead of democracy, just so we can think about it as degrees of democratization and not using the term democracy, which has become very essentialized in day-to-day narratives. So just so we can pass to understand the mass incarceration in Brazil, there has been an unequivocal rise in absolute and proportional figures throughout the 1990s, and more significantly in the 2000s. The peaks of acceleration of that process were 2005 and then 2015. There is an important consideration on that there was an increase in incarceration rates of both convicts and non-convicts. And I believe, here I use the term non-convicts just because when we say pre-trial detention, we assume that there's going to be a trial, but the arbitrariness levels in Brazil are so high, we cannot assume that there is going to be a trial. So I prefer to use the term non-convict incarceration. And I think it is important to understand that both of these types of imprisonment, of course, are related to the functioning of the whole criminal justice system, but they relate more closely to different aspects of it, different dynamics in play. So convicted incarceration relates more closely to criminal proceeding laws regarding evidence. So here in Brazil, we have a very low standard for evidence in criminal proceedings, and many people are convicted even though there are no evidence of their actual involvement in crime, in a particular crime, and time-serving rules. So changes in how people serve their time also relate closely to convicted incarceration. But when we talk about non-convict incarceration, it is profoundly linked to policing and the societal and judiciary control over it. And that's what I'll be focusing on. So just so you can see our unequivocal rise in incarceration in Brazil, though the red line is the incarceration rate, the blue bars are the incarcerated number of people in absolute figures. Here you see the importance of non-convicted prisoners, how it is a part of the increase in incarceration, a very significant part of it. And now that we have understood that, I'll be arguing the case of São Paulo. São Paulo, for those who don't know, is this state in the southeast of Brazil. And I believe it represents urban Brazil very well. Its population is 44, almost 45 million people. Just so you can have an idea, that's the whole population of Argentina. It's a very big state, and it's also the most industrialized and the wealthiest state in Brazil. And besides, it has a very significant weight in the mass incarceration nationwide. So a lot of strong similarities we can see between the incarceration in São Paulo and in Brazil, as I will show you. So here's the same chart that I have presented before, but now including the rate for São Paulo and the prison population in São Paulo, and that behaves very similar to the Brazil rates, and more importantly, it has increased its importance throughout the mass incarceration process. So also the imprisonment of non-convicts is very similar in São Paulo and Brazil. And for that, I believe I've made my point on how São Paulo is a significant explanation. It does not explain away Brazil. We cannot treat Brazil as a whole, but I do believe that it carries similarities to urban places in Brazil. And it is in itself a significant explanation. It carries a significant explanation for Brazilian mass incarceration. So to get to those points in the second part of my talk, so the case study and the proper content of my research, I will argue that this rise in non-convict incarceration cannot be explained only by the change in crime rates. I don't want to get to take too much time on that, but if you see the figures on, the crime rates for the crimes that incarcerate the most in São Paulo and in Brazil as well, there hasn't been a significant increase that would explain sufficiently how the incarceration of non-convicts has risen. And so you can look how that looks like in a chart. But to the argument, I believe that police activities and the judiciary approach towards them are significant explanations for mass incarceration in São Paulo. We have some data that supports that. So 75% of all custodial arrests are made by the state military police, which is the responsible for more than 95% of all stop and search practices in São Paulo, and that's the case for most states in Brazil. And that nearly half of all custodial arrestees face pretrial detention determined by a judge. But that's official data. So based on that, I believe that this correlation that is obvious in the chart also carries a causal link, a causal relationship. And mass incarceration in São Paulo, I will argue that the changing policy that contributed the most to mass incarceration was turning stop and search practices into a policy that had custodial arrest as its main goal. These policies were a result of a reform process that failed the promise to overcome the tradition of police arbitrariness in the country. So that all happened, the reform process started in the transition from a military dictatorship to a republic. There are changes in policy here that I believe might be understood through the Foucauldian notions of disciplinarian and securitarian predominance in social control, which I won't be getting into because of time. But I will say that in that period, the challenges to police reform in the transition period were mainly the high crime rates that were quite demoralizing to the military criminal policy, and the fact that Brazil did not have a transitional justice experience that took off the conductors of the dictatorship of power. So we had still hardline officials of the military in power, especially in the military police and the public security field. So during that transition from a military dictatorship to a republic, the opposition to dictatorship had a great success in the 82 elections, the first free election since 64, when the coup d'etat instituted the dictatorship. But they made some political choices in order to accommodate their interests and the interests of the military who were still in power. So they legalized police arbitrariness through the Temporary Prison Act, which is in 89, the opposition, which was in power, so they weren't the opposition anymore, but the people that were the opposition to the dictatorship and now were in power, supported this Temporary Prison Act, which basically turned imprisonment by police legal in the country. So a practice that was very frowned upon and criticized all throughout the period of the dictatorship, of the police just taking people on the street and based on suspicion and arresting them, became legal in 89 in Brazil, and it still is legal. And also they conducted the educational searches program throughout the Polo operations. So all throughout the 80s, police were very resistant to reform, but some of the new things that the opposition and the military still in power could agree on was Polo operations, which means localized policing operations that conducted educational searches. That meant searches, massive searches on population in different public places in order to educate them to carry their IDs with them. So if the police asked for it, they could provide it and not be arrested, because in the future, if they didn't provide their IDs, they would be arrested for not identifying themselves to the police. And also another political choice.
You have just 5 minutes left.
Okay, thank you. Another political choice was amplifying state capacity. So there was a very considerable investment in more equipment, very focused on patrolling, so buying new cars and radio equipment and more personnel. But that didn't stop the police legitimation crisis that happened, because there were high crime rates, various corruption scandals, police violence, and congressional pressures for police reform. So in a scenario of demoralization, police finally caved to a reform program, which happened in the mid-90s and had a managerial orientation very clearly, efficiency-driven. And that's when Stop and Search became a policy that promised preventative and proactive policing. That was the promise. So if police were searching people on the street, they were looking for objects that were robbed and they were looking for guns, they would prevent crime and they would show people they were working. And the whole idea of a police that does not control crime would be linked only to the military conducting of things. So there was a standardization of stop and search practices. A lot of protocols were developed in police in order to standardize and to make policemen feel safer in the time when they were stopping and searching people. They started teaching to policemen how to argue legally the grounds for stop and search, and they also put some productivity goals for stop and search. So stop and search became a productivity measure. There in some places there are quantified goals of how many people must be searched in a turn of service in a timetable they have there. And they also have custodial arrest as the primary goal of these So they stop and search a lot in order to get custodial arrests, in order to surprise people red-handed in the act of committing a crime, which is very complicated. I won't get into it, but the institution has developed informal award systems that awards policemen that realize custodial arrests. So the political meanings of that are that the military regime and the liberal opposition groups that came into power were together in this failing the structural reform and the amplifying state capacity. Also, different groups inside the military police forces had an alliance to ensure institutional survival, and stop and search policy became some sort of exhaust valve for social tension. So productivity was very valuable to the liberal opposition groups that had now these numbers of how many people were searched to show as a productivity achievement, and they didn't touch the discretion of policemen when they are executing that practice. So everybody was happy. In a simplified way, we can say that. The role of the judiciary is very important. The judiciary went through a reform in the mid-2000s that put some productivity goals as well that might explain their involvement in this. But what I would like to finish to say is that the implications for the punitive turn argument, what I believe we can say for sure is that there was an increasement in social control. So instead of now Brazil has a predominance of prison, I think it is overlapping. So before we didn't imprison as much, but we had already a lot of police arbitrariness that has overlapped with imprisonment. And about punitiveness, I believe it's a more difficult argument for us to make. I think the panels later on will be talking about this, how in some cases, punitiveness did not increase. I mean, the violence inside prisons in Brazil has decreased, and for a very considerable period of time in the early 2000s and on, the violence in the peripheries and the urban peripheries has diminished as well. So that's a more difficult and complicated argument to make. But that's all for me. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jessica. So the following presentation is from Daniel Pontón Cevallos from Instituto de Altos Estudios Nacionales from Ecuador. So I don't see you.
Hi, everybody.
Okay, there you are.
Let me start with the presentation. Can you hear me? Okay.
If you want to share your screen.
Okay. Sorry. Yeah, I want to share my screen. Can you see? Yeah. Okay. My presentation aims is drugs police and the pastoral power, a perspective on the punitive subject in Ecuador 2010-2019. I will read because my English is not so fluent, but I will try to be more slow words. This presentation shows the result of the research in development, which seeks to complement some theoretical analytical gaps in my doctoral thesis called Drugs, Globalization and Punishment, an approach to the police governance against drugs in Ecuador 2011-2016. The object of the study focused on the decisional nature of the punitive turn towards drugs in 2015 in Ecuador. This decision was a result of the surprising transformation of the tables for regulation of drug trafficking and consumption in 2014 to regulate the punitive excess of the prohibitionism. The consequence of this decision meant that 2 years later, the number of inmates grew by more than 100% due to this type of crime. It should be noted that this punitive turn against drugs took place in the sui generis context of the transformation of punitive policy in the country. Indeed, since 2009, a sustained growth in its population of prisoners began to be observed, with practically quadrupled, reaching to close 40,000 inmates in 2019. Meanwhile, I have read with great interest the theory of punishment as social institutions by David Garland. I found this theory very interesting to understand the dimension of punishment from a cultural point of view. It was a very good approach to understand a wide explanation about what was happening in Ecuador with the punishment institutions. In 2019, I carried out an investigation that argues that a big part of the responsibility for this radical turn of punishment in Ecuador was due to the establishment in 2010 of COMSTAT. As we know, COMSTAT is a very powerful tool for a police management in concept of high crime rates. This managerial technology is based on the system where the operational controls of the police identify hotspots through geographic platforms in order to increase police productivity by combining elements of direct criminalization, neutralization with control mechanisms of social incivilities as crime prevention strategies. Under this new rationality, it is logical to assume that improvement in capacity for arrest and control visibility that affect the proliferation of crime increase substantially the flow of the prisoner. This management philosophy has had an important effect of the use of the punishment in Ecuador. Due to its high capacity to increase production, COMSTAT is also offered as a highly strategic tool in the communication, production of security government effects. Within this category, drug control takes a fundamental value, although in the management of crime policy, a small time strict drug trafficking and predatory crime are minor crimes that volume and easy of arrest fit the statistic of police production and are shown as a good result of effort against crime. The explanation of why this crime, mostly young, poor, or ethnic minority groups, fit the stock of prison population is due precisely of this audience problem. The COMSTAT in Ecuador took the name of Balanced Scorecard, in Spanish CMI, at the beginning of 2010. The system of this decision was a systematic process of institutional effort for using technology in order to reduce crime and improve the security governance. The incorporation of this technology in 2010 promoted the decentralized operational transformation in the national police called districts, circuits, and sub-circuits. The purpose of this plan was to generate a more efficient and equitable system for the allocation of infrastructure, logistics, and police personnel in the territory. It is not intended to affirm that the COMSTAT has been the only cause of the growth of the prison population in these 10 years. In this sense, the contribution of other punitive actions that have progressive influence in this escalation cannot be denied. One of the factors has been attributed to the use of the abuse of the figure of preventive detention. However, it is necessary to affirm that these measures have had different gradations throughout these 19 years, and that it has consisted with several attempts to attenuate or establish legal limits for its use. This situation leads to the conclusion that in general spectrum, the legal forms are important, but these were many times at the mercy of the response of different political moments. Pretrial detention in this case would be a weapon, but not only the most important factor that originate this unprecedented prison boom in Ecuador. Under this logic, constant contribution in Ecuador will be placed at the center of the gravity of the new punitive area in Ecuador. An important issue was marked by the problem of drug trafficking control. Despite the fact that Ecuador discriminalization drugs use in Ecuador in 1997, in 2011, the control of retail became priority. However, the fine line between trafficking and consumption was easily crossed over to the use of the punitive resource. Therefore, the retail control has systematically and exponentially increased the number of detainees for drug possession and trafficking since 2010. In general way, it can be said that the growing flow of the prison population has been impacted by growing deal of police arrests for property crime and drug crimes. There is a close correlation between these two types of crime in annual prison staff. Drugs were considered a risk factor for crime instead of public health problem. But constant philosophy has not only been directed at institutional management, which has undoubtedly had an impact to increase in the prison population. Beyond the effect of crime reduction, the use of punitive resource has also had an important effect in institutional governance toward security in this period. It allows us to affirm that below of technical elements, the dynamic performance of the punitive strategic managed by the constant had a high public acceptance. Therefore, it improved the governmental management of security. Between 2010 to 2017, the popularity of the policy grew significantly. However, the question remains on how this technology belongs, being a response to the population in terms of the more efficient management of police resource. It connects with citizen audience, and how can we to understand the role of drug punishment in this context. Therefore, the concept of pastoral power developed by Mauricio Foucault caught my attention to account how an old cultural phobia against drug has recreated and reproduced this punitive escalation. Through a documentary analysis, the idea is to investigate how this idea of pastoral power contributes to understanding of the governmental rationality of the drug punishment in Ecuador. I argue that drugs permit to connect an old and new penal culture. The purpose of the penalization understood from a cultural perspective not only must be seen from its instrumental or functional logic, but from various lines of social logic that compose and shape it. The punishment against drug fits into the cultural dimension under the idea that this institution recreates and reproduces punitive schemes with several trajectories. It is precisely on this cultural idea that the theme of the pastoral power is linked. In 1978, Michel Foucault was moving from his initial ideas of discipline and geopolitics to what he later called governmentality. In this sense, for this author, the art of government has several dimensions. It is not only limited by the sphere of the government of the state, but also the government of family and the government of itself. In other words, the moral government. However, the idea of governmentality could not have been born without the old and archaic influence of pastoral power that in Foucault's work was typical of the Jewish and Christian religion. The secular state, therefore, adopts these old ideas and overlaps with the role of the doctors, public officials, and, of course, the police. Therefore, modern community police is an inheritance of this pastoral power that is deified and actualized and reproduced through punishment. Only in this way will it be explained that the puritanical ideas of punishment against drug reach current meanings. This allows to reproduce an idea in a modern context. Foucault reveals with this his intention to understand the modern individualization process with the influence of this pastoral power. The punishment against drug is an expression of the old idea of individualism. Consequently, this sense and meaning of the complex and fragmentary urban life in its values. The deep root process of social modernization understand urbanism reproduce a series of meaning and shape the penal institution such as the police drugs. This is why the punishment against drugs is a resistance to change, and it promotes new ideas through the technology capacity. To understand the influence of pastoral power in the modern context in Ecuador, the discussion might be posed within the historical perspective. In this sense, the legislation against drugs in Ecuador dates from the beginning of the 20th century, where an adaptive and dynamic to the international legislation was observed. However, the legalistic explanation does not explain the social meaning and give rise to this problem, nor the social and political emphasis that has been given to drugs. For this reason, it is necessary to say that, like other realities, the criminalization of drugs was born by a Puritan heritage that has been fed by the gradual process of social and cultural transformation of global society, of which Ecuador has been part. The punitive counter-reform against drugs in 2015 must therefore be framed within the framework of this current and persistent punitive ideology against drugs that makes global issue make cultural sense in local reality. This led to the drug policy being placed as a priority issue on the public agenda in Ecuador in the 1970s and 1980s. The modernization process triggered a series of social fears, one of which led to a greater punitive burden in the face of the problem. For example, Paladines showed in a study how in the approval of the process of the law in 108 in 1990, there were speeches already given by the congressmen who sought to justify the approval of the law based on the growth of consumption. Although the product of this created new drug institutionality in Ecuador in the 90s, the different argument used the moralistic and punitive solution to the problem of the drugs. Therefore, the conservative background of solution went along of question of political ideology, since the pitches spoke in terms of highly concerned and violated community. This suggests that the policy
Sorry, Daniel, you have 5 minutes left.
This suggests that the policy of punishment against drugs was a part of an expanded consensus in which a series of public hearings was articulated on an installed audience ideology against drugs. In other words, evidence of pastoral power trapped in by state rationalities. Despite this, the tables of regulation were made within the framework of the old ideology that demand a punitive resources as mechanism in terms of effects to reduce consumption and sales of drugs in Ecuador. This is why the analysis of punitive turn in drug policy in Ecuador from the reform of tables must be understood with this punitive cultural context. That is, the technical decision to create mechanisms that limit the negative externalities of the prohibitionism was installed as highly unpopular measure that broke a series of common meanings present as social imaginaries in the population. Aldis was coining the idea that of policy society against drugs that in some other ways has been shaped by an embryonic idea of proximity police. Police pastoral power, therefore, was a systematic process coined by this all-phobic anti-drug social idea. For example, at the beginning of the 90s in Ecuador, a police model of approaching the population began to be evidenced with the creation of the immediate assistance post, in Spanish PAI, in 1991. In fact, community policies strategies in their full sense of the word began to be already implemented in Quito in 2003 and in 2005 throughout Ecuador. Under this logic, it was sought to political manage that the administration of the daily life by the state, through which government lead the police agencies some of the basic task regulation of social relationship. Rather, it is the institutional power where drugs problem was positioned itself as a matter of highly institutional, assimilated as part of the police attitudes. Therefore, phobia against drugs was also an institutional process of adaptation to the complex social processes. In this new cultural logic in police since 90s rose with the hygienist discourse against drugs, which labeled under the denominative risk factor when the punishment boom took place in 2010. As a result of this need for drug control began to position the systematic of possession as a mechanism to combat retail. This rationality is very present in the current drug control agenda in Ecuador. In other words, a process of indirect criminalization fueled by the social phobia against drugs that combines to this day. I think so my presentation had more work that I think is the time is over. For me, it's okay. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Daniel. So the following presenter is Diego Zysman from University of Buenos Aires, Argentina. So welcome, Diego. If you want to share your screen. Okay. Sorry, Diego, are you there?
I think you're muted.
Yeah.
I need to share again.
Yeah.
I say thank you, Luis, and thank you, Maximo, for the whole organization of this event. We shall now. Okay, sharing now.
Yes, perfect.
Okay. Okay, this is the short abstract of my presentation. And the question is, does the authoritarian past experience lead to the subsequent punitivity of the democratic penal system, or does it prevent its recurrence? In many other South American countries that experience military dictatorships or armed conflicts, Argentina since the late 80s has increasingly used incarceration, although with great differences at different political times. The question is then, what kind of punitive mechanism can be restricted by the authoritarian past, and through what instruments or actions, and which ones cannot? Well, in the first part, we will move to explain shortly the idea of the transition to democracy in Latin America and in Argentina in particular. This is the transition to democracy in different countries in the 80s, the third wave, as Huntington mentioned it. Let me just maybe use this. Okay. The third wave, we can see Argentina in 1983, after Ecuador, Bolivia, Honduras, and before Uruguay, Brazil, El Salvador, and some others. Between 1930 and 1983, Argentina experienced 6 coups d'etat led by military interventionists, and in between short periods of weak democratic rule. The last and the most repressive coup included Catholic fundamentalism against the leftist subversion of Western values in the context of the Cold War and the local armed insurgents. State violence included media censorship, illegal detention, breaking and entering, political imprisonment, military controls in the streets, torture, and summary executions, but also practices that were quite unlike those of other Latin American dictatorships. Thousands of disappearances, claim 30,000 disappeared, demonstrate both the state's systematic plan to exterminate opponents and the clandestinity of political martyrs. Argentina is a global leader in human rights prosecution, and arrived to this transition not in a way of negotiate transition as Chile, Uruguay, or Brazil. Argentina is the first global truth commission, has the first truth commission in 1984 to precede trials and not to replace them as South Africa post-apartheid, and it started a high-level, high-ranked human rights prosecution that still till 2021. It has one of the longest records of prosecuting human rights abuses before the transition in the world. But it has 3 moments. It's very difficult to explain this in a short time. Then I will just mention the 3 moments. The original moment between 1983 and 1986, and between 1986 and 1983, a second moment with pardons and amnesties, and a third moment of restarting a reboot in the prosecution of state crimes as crimes against humanity after 2006, the first trial. We will see some official data here. I maybe just want to pay attention. Nowadays, there are more than 3,000 people involved in criminal investigations, more than 1,000 of convicted people after trials, and more different kind of trials in the last years. We will see it better here. Since 2006 and 2021, it started in the 80s, but after the reboot in 2006, we can see different trials, number of trials. This number of trials involve different people, okay, different accused. We don't have here, but the total number is 3,000 more or less, and we will see that the trials continue every year till this moment, till the present. Now I will move to the idea, to the concept of punitiveness that I am handling here for this presentation. Punitiveness here takes into consideration the class of penalties contemplated in the legislation and used by judges, the penalty, temporary or life imprisonment, and that in the case of Argentina, of course, the extent to which they are applied, the same and the measures that produce a certain amount of pain, although they are not strictly considered penalties. But it also identifies certain proposals of theories of punishment as more punitive than others because of the representation of the convicted people from whom they start. For example, general incapacitation versus rehabilitation. In relation with democracy and punishment, there are different studies in the last 20 or 30 years, maybe. No, there are some reflection on specific penalties of democratic societies, studies on punitive expansion of and prison overcrowding, a lot, of course, research on punitive laws born in democracy, like the three-strike laws in California, USA, you know, the works of Simmering, Hawkins, and Cumming. Democratic studies related with the idea of the democratic commitment with a low rate of criminality and incarceration and punitivity, the Custer and the Free, for example, and studies related with the idea of deliberative democracy and punishment, Private and Petit, Sur, Gargarella, Rowan, some others. Maybe some specific works in USA related with the idea of democracy and disenfranchisement. No? There are very well-known studies of Ewan, Mansa, and Thompson, and some others of Eugen related with the idea of disenfranchisement. And of course, theoretical and empirical approaches from philosophy, political science, law, and criminology of special importance for this work related with the idea of transitional justice, titled between some others, a lot of others. In this way, transitional democracies and punishment turns to the idea of the global thought and the idea in connection with democracies. It's a claim that Kaliotis and Soso mentioned in this article, an edited issue of Punishment and Society 2016, and they also have discussed the idea and the claim that transitional democracies are less punitive, or at least not all types of democracy have also recognized the specificities that exist between democracy and punishment in countries with different histories, political and economic traditions, and institutional organization and cultural dynamics. And it's at water. Okay. Seeking also from studies in transitional justice, using a data set shows the dissuasive effect of the correlation that that allows to make an hypothesis in relation with the dissuasive effect of the trials for human rights violations nationally and even cross-border against the state repression. State repression like disappearances, torture, murders, and some other. But also Trejo, Albarracín, and Tiscornia, using a dataset of 76 countries that transitioned from authoritarian rule to democracy between 1974 and 2005, go further and say that trials also decrease criminal violence in organized violence, homicides, and some other kind of criminal violence, general criminal violence. If we think in the experience of authoritarian past and punitiveness, we can also think that collective memory of state crimes of the dictatorships in Argentina, as also says, difficult to promote punitiveness toward ordinary criminality. No? This is connected with the idea of Cevallos in Nazi Germany or Downs in Netherlands that mentioned the idea that after the Nazism, it was very difficult to promote punitiveness due to the experience of the authoritarian past. This is not the same, the dictatorship in Argentina that the Nazi rule during the Second World War, but the idea, I think, is connected. In Argentina, armed forces are not involved in the fight against crime, including drug trafficking, as is very common in other parts of Latin America. To the request of the first president after dictatorship, for example, a law in 1984 equated the penalties of the crime of torture with the idea of prevent the torture with homicide, which was until then the most serious crime. No? Torture started to be the most serious crime after transition. And some harsh measures were blocked. For example, police interrogation powers, legal investigation over fundamental constitutional guarantees, the reintroduction of the death penalty, legally forbidden by human rights covenants, but there was a bill in 1990 that was really rejected, a bill sent by the president in 1990s, Carlos Menem, that was just for 1 week in the parliament and then was withdrawn. And also the penal populist legislation. In fact, in 2004, there were a lot of laws that modified our criminal code, but who has no real impact probably between us. Also, the idea of moderate sentences to prison for minor crimes and even limits for serious ones, such as life imprisonment without parole. The collective memory of human rights violations was also reinforced through court proceedings in mass atrocities. This idea is mentioned in Cevallos and also is endorsed by Seeking in transitional justice studies. Seeking point out Argentina as a special case in the origin of transitional justice, Cascada de Justicia, justice cascade in Latin America and in the world. Now, when we think in incarceration, this is not so clear. Argentina reached the same numbers of inmates as at the end of the dictatorship in 1989, no? 66 per 100,000 in 1999, no? 66. The reality nowadays is completely different. This situation changed dramatically after governmental pardons, particularly in the mid-90s, when both the fear of crime and the indicator of punitiveness grew sharply. However, between 2005 and 2007, while restarting the prosecution of state crimes as crimes against humanity, there was a slight increase in prison population, and it then began to increase moderately in relative terms until 2015. At the end of 2015, before the pandemic, there were more than 100,000 people incarcerated, and there were more than 200 or 224, 243 if we take into account the other facilities different from prison as our present numbers. It was never possible to return to the low European indices of the incarceration of the first years of democracy. Then, this is in the Spanish story, but this is the evolution of the prison population from the 2000 in the last 20 years, more or less. You can see more or less sustained number of prison, no? In 2008, 2009, 2010, then is slightly elevating. Then in the last 5 and 6 years, there's a sharply amount of incarcerated people in jails, prison and jails. And well, I have 5 minutes, Victoria.
Yes, you have 5 minutes.
More 5 minutes. Okay, I need just some final thoughts. The experience of the authoritarian past does not necessarily continue with punitivism after transition. Some countries like Argentina can block certain forms of punitiveness after transition. This reaction was not only an attempt to be in tune with the established Western democracy. I think there's a lot to think about this point. But the instrumental and symbolic reaction against authoritarianism seems more relevant. The idea of the reaction against the past. Mass incarceration was not a feature of local authoritarianism in the 80s, of course, nor was it blocked by the transition, even because the transition justice movement claimed to incarcerate criminals of the authoritarian past. Then the idea of the prison as a penalty relevant for a democracy that want to adjust count with the past it was and it is so relevant in some way. The collective memory of the authoritarian past sustained over years in the trials seems to play a relevant role in this, as Seeking and some others mentioned from the point of view of the transitional justice studies. The number of processes, their extension in time and convictions seem important, but for how long? No? How many years after the transition this memory of the past could really play a relevant role trying to limit the number of the imprisoned people? This is my last question. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Diego. Well, now we have, I don't see you, Ian Loader, there you are. So now Ian Loader is going to share his comments and questions from the presentation. So welcome, Ian.
Thank you. Right, thank you very much. Thank you very much to the 3 speakers. They were all great papers from which I learned an awful lot. I have been, unlike my colleague Mary this morning, I have been a discussant before, though I do share some of her kind of puzzle as to exactly what discussants are to do. So my interpretation of the task is really to kind of just pick up on a number of themes in each paper and just try and both connect them as best I can to one another and to some of the bigger themes and questions that have emerged in the context of the conference. I'm going to start with, I'll take them in turn, so I'll start with Jessica's. I had the benefit of reading the written version of this, in which she kind of says she wants to tell a kind of local story about the historical particularities of the different forms that social control has taken in recent decades in Brazil, focusing in particular on both on stop and search and the punishment of non-convicts. And the focus, as she said, on Sao Paulo. This is by no means my main point. There is a kind of methodological question about the choice of Sao Paulo. And I wasn't sure what the answer to that question was. So one version of this is that Sao Paulo kind of stands in for the whole of Brazil for reasons that you kind of articulated. Or I wasn't sure whether you were basically making a different kind of claim, which there's in the kind of comparative study of punishment and social control, we should really make cities and regions our unit of analysis and comparison rather than nation states. I mean, similar arguments have been made, for example, by Vanessa Barker some time back in relation to the study of American punishment. So I was unclear which of those 2 positions you were taking. But anyway, that's a digression. So the story you tell is really a story about it's a story about social control, and three things occurred to me in the context of this. One of which is it was just kind of interesting to me. I mean, I've always been more of a policing scholar than I have been a kind of punishment and society person. I feel I kind of hang around on the edges of the punishment and society world. So it was striking to me in a conference on punishment and the global peripheries to see a paper about policing. And I'm trying to reflect on what we do with that. Because my starting assumption, and it's possible to kind of overplay this, that in large parts of the world, the kind of scholarly communities that focus their attention on policing are different to the scholarly communities that focus their attention on punishment. They kind of hang around in different conferences, they publish in different journals, they may occasionally talk to each other. But the kind of mass incarceration story, the punishment story that gets told in the pages of Punishment Society, for instance, isn't for the most part a story about policing. There are some notable exceptions. So it struck me as incredibly refreshing to have a paper about punishment, which took very seriously the idea that the police are there at the beginning of this process, and they're a massively important institution of social sorting, and that have all kinds of fateful consequences for the size and shape and scale and quality of the prison population. I think you did that extremely well. Secondly, it's a story, and I'm going to come back to this when I talk about Diego's paper. It's a story about the kind of reinvention and continuity of a certain type of style of social control, namely stop and search, and the kind of replacement of stop and search, or the transformation of stop and search for a mechanism for the control of political opponents under military dictatorship, for something that gets recalibrated under the sign of security in the context of democracy. And along the way, I think you make two interesting points. One is this point about bureaucratization. I'm going to come back to that because that puzzled me. And the other is this idea that stop and search, which in a sense, if you think about it in formal terms, is a power, actually morphs into a policy and an explicit statement of what policing is actually about. And that also struck me as interesting. The third thing that struck me as important here is, or puzzling in a way, is that you're very determined. You tell a very rich story about Brazil, which is very rooted in the kind of institutional and political structure and history of that place, or Sao Paulo, I should say. But to anyone who studied policing in any other part of the world, this doesn't look like a local story at all. It looks like a story that we've seen versions of in many other places, many other times before, which is that stop and search is a kind of all-purpose kind of mechanism that police forces throughout the world use as a way of regulating marginal populations, largely with impunity. In other words, under very light, borderline, non-existent forms of legal regulation and judicial oversight. So in a context of trying to kind of foster a conversation between the global north and the global south, it struck me that the peculiarities of your paper were of great interest, but the ways in which this paper just didn't seem peculiar at all to anyone who studied stop and search or police power in any other part of the world, I think also stand in need of some reflection, save for the two exceptions. And the two exceptions, and these are the ones, one of which is about this kind of puzzling relationship between what you call bureaucratization and arbitrariness. And of course, those two things don't really fit together, because bureaucratization is meant to be a series of mechanisms that stop power being exercised on an arbitrary basis. So I wonder whether actually what you were describing really wasn't bureaucratization at all. It was a kind of rationalization of a power that kind of supercharged it so it could be operated more effectively in new kinds of ways. The second puzzle is why the arrest? Why did stop and search become recalibrated as a policy that enabled the police to suck marginal populations into the custodial system? And I say that's a puzzle because there's a kind of another reading of stop and search, which thinks of it as a mechanism through which the state can kind of manage the streets with only very selective recourse to sucking people into the system. In other words, it's a form of a very loosely governed form of power that enables street control without all that processing of people through the system. And there's the colloquial way in which cops generally put it is that stop and search is the way in which people is the power that enables them to remind people who's in charge on a kind of ongoing basis. So that struck me as in need of explanation about why stop and search became a mechanism of mass incarceration rather than a mechanism of kind of almost extrajudicial control of the marginal, in which case it starts to have a kind of parallel with that we know about extrajudicial killing in the Brazilian context, carried out by both the police and, of course, I was reminded of Graham Denver Willis's book, The Killing Consensus, which is about Sao Paulo, and it's all about the kind of ways in which the police and the organised crime groups kind of divide up this task between them. So that was really what I had to say about that paper. Danielle's paper had well, it was similarly puzzling to me and interesting to me as a policing scholar. That here again was another paper about punishment and the expansion of a prison population that was principally interested in policing and making policing a kind of central actor in that story. So that struck me as also being of interest. And it was also a story which is kind of familiar to people who think about the kind of import and export of kind of crime control technologies across the world, because at one level it seemed like a story about the importation of a kind of popular and well supported and heavily promoted American crime control technique, namely ComStat, into a very different cultural and political context, and therefore a story about kind of what happens through that process of importation and adaptation. And the interesting part of that story to me, forgive me, Daniel, if I've understood any of this wrong, is the way it became attached and enabled, and either enabled or provided a conduit for a series of kind of pre-existing kind of cultural sensibilities to do with drugs that created this, that enabled and created the certain kind of pastoral policing of drugs that you described. Now, although that sounded to me to be super interesting and largely persuasive, though I did have a couple of questions. One was why the punitive turn against drugs, and I say this because, insofar as the kind of Foucault's conception of pastoral power has kind of been translated into a policing context, it's translated into a conception of policing which is kind of ambient, is kind of community oriented, has something to do with the kind of the daily attendance to the flock, rather than selecting certain members of that flock to be removed and placed in penal institutions. And that didn't seem to be the story that you told. So I was wondering what explained the kind of punitive carceral version of the kind of police involvement in drugs policing, rather than something that might have looked rather more, on one reading of the term, rather more pastoral. I'll do a second version. Yeah, I think I've wrapped 2 points up into one then. So anyway, so it's why policing took that form and why the kind of punitive element of the turn towards drugs. And I may just have not followed the argument properly, but it wasn't clear to me what the answer to that question was. Finally, and then we can throw this open. Diego's paper was super interesting. One, because it returned us to some of the things that we were talking about yesterday, to do with kind of legacies of the past and the way in which they kind of operate as kind of shadows over what's possible and not possible in the present. But also seemed on the surface to tell a rather different story than many of the stories we hear about legacies, which is the way in which the knowledge of a certain kind of authoritarian atrocity and the process of kind of the architecture of accountability that is generated by democracies to enable societies to know about that has a kind of series of ongoing tempering effects upon the will to punish. And that struck me as really important and interesting, and raised a whole series of questions that I don't know the answer to. And I just really wanted just to throw things into conversation that we might all, they're not just for you, Diego, we might all talk about them. One of which is, in the Argentinian case, I suppose the easy answer to this question is both. But I wonder what's doing the work. Is what's doing the work the specificities of the atrocity in the Argentinian case, the disappearances, the length of military rule, or does it also require the process of accountability and bringing to justice that Argentina has gone through? And of course, those two things are related because you come to know partly through the process of accounting. But I wonder where you thought the explanatory weight there lies. Secondly, I wondered what, insofar as what's going on here is the generation of a certain kind of consciousness, a certain kind of sense of what is possible and impossible given what we know about this country's past, where that consciousness is located. So is the story you tell really a story about elites and a story about what judicial and political elites and legal elites kind of think about crime and justice and punishment, given all that we've been through? Or is also that some aspect of that also reproduced at the level of popular consciousness in the culture generally, so that elites to some extent feel constrained by what they think the kind of everyday consciousnness of groups in civil society actually are. Thirdly, I have two more points. Thirdly, it also struck me, it took me to be saying that in a sense that what this generated is a whole series of kind of restraints on punitiveness, but that hasn't stood in the way of an increasing resort to prison as an institution for the governance of crime, which struck me as, so one way of describing that situation would be, prison without punitiveness. And I wondered how we're supposed to think about the condition of prison without punitiveness. And then finally, I want to circle back around to Jessica's paper, because they did strike me looking at this from many, many miles away as an outsider, to be two very different stories. So you wanted to tell a story about the ways in which the kind of knowledge and coming to terms with the history of military dictatorship actually has shaped a rather different criminal justice landscape in contemporary Argentina, where I took Jess to be really telling a story of continuity. It's about how certain forms of social control or certain forms of police and penal practices have managed to reinvent themselves under democratic political regimes in ways that look kind of functionally equivalent to what used to go on under military dictatorship. Anyway, so those are my thoughts.